Okay, so what I want to do with you guys is I want to talk about moral arguments. So what I want to do is I don't want to just give you one argument to analyze. So in the reading, you'll see uh, William Lane Craig has an argument for you to analyze, to think about. But I want to talk about more just the structure of all moral arguments. And I think this will help you to think about arguments more for yourself. It'll even kind of give you some tools you could use if you wanted to construct your own argument. So I want to kind of give you some more resources to get to the foundations of these arguments. So the first thing that an argument does is it helps us to analyze some data. Okay, so when we looked at the fine-tuning argument, we're looking at the data relevant to the fine-tuning of our universe. Or when we looked at the argument from cause and effect, we had some causal data, and then we built an argument from there. When it comes to moral arguments, the data that we're going to be looking at here, I feel like I want to draw this here. Here's our data, okay? This is our moral, M for moral data. And this will include various observations about the moral landscape, we could call it. So we could divide this into three different types of data. There's the data of moral experience. So this would be like the experience that you're doing something good, or the experience that you're doing something bad, or the experience that you should do something, or the experience that something's gone terribly wrong here. So, we're having this online class now because of the coronavirus, and there are all sorts of viruses out there. Coronavirus is just one of them. There's other viruses out there right now, and you might have the feeling that there's something bad about that. Like, this is a problem. It's a problem for people to suffer and to die. This is all part of your moral experience, the experience of good and bad. Okay, now there's a lot of things we could say about that, this experience. But one thing you might wonder is whether this experience has anything to do with actual reality. So one of the debates that philosophers have is about whether moral experience tracks a kind of objective moral order. And we talked about objective morality before. I gave you a presentation on that. And you might think there is no objective morality. You might think there's just your moral experience. Okay? But that's still data. The data that you have the experience that something has gone wrong, or the feeling that you should do something. That's still something. Now, you might think that in addition to these experiences, there's also actually moral facts. And I use that term fact, but when philosophers use that term, what we mean is some kind of true proposition. So let's say a moral principles that are actually true. Principles. Okay. So an example would be, it's good to be kind to people, and this is a principle of goodness. It's not just that you experience, it's not just that you have the feeling that you should be kind. It's that it is actually good to be kind. And even if you're not having that experience, still the state of affairs of being kind has goodness. It's a real property of that state of affairs. So there's moral principles, and then there's moral beings, or moral agents. Moral agents. Looks like a G, that should have been an A there. Moral agents. Okay. You know what I'm trying to write there. So moral experience, moral principles, and then moral agents. So the idea here is an agent is a being that is capable of having a moral experience. It's a being that's capable of considering a moral principle. It's a being that you might say is a locus of value. There's all sorts of properties that would go into a moral agent, but it would be basically the kind of thing, the kind of reality that is an agent, is able to act, and is a moral agent because it's able to act in moral ways. It's able to act towards the good. And I want to leave this open, whether the moral agent, whether there's any kind of objective value to the agent. I want to leave that open. but at least the moral agent can have moral experiences. So this is some of the moral data, okay? Now, I'm not saying this is all the data, but this is a nice way of framing large sets of data. You've got the moral experience, the moral principles, and then the moral agents. And this data then can be used as a resource for building arguments, right, that have to do with the ultimate nature of reality. Now, one version or one argument, I want to show you two kinds of arguments. One kind of argument is the deductive argument, where you take some data and then you deduce from that data some conclusion. So you've seen William Lane Craig's version of the argument here. Let's pick a different color. Could go like this. Number one, objective. See how I'm writing backwards like that? Objective, moral, there we go. Objective moral duties exist, or objective moral principles exist. Since I put principles above, we'll use the language of principles. This would be true propositions that would describe duties. Look, it's hard for me to type and talk at the same time. Look at that. Prince should be an I. Objective moral principles exist. Cross that X. And then the idea here is that these things wouldn't exist unless there was some supreme moral anchor, which we might call God. So we'll say, if one is true, then God exists. Therefore, God exists. Okay. Now, notice here that I focused on moral principles. And this is just one part of the moral landscape of data that we have. You could run a similar argument with respect to moral agents, or even just moral experience. So some people think, I think it's sort of in the popular culture, they'll hear this version of the argument from morality in terms of objective moral principles, and so they'll think that therefore all moral arguments require this particular form. And a lot of people haven't considered that you could also give an argument just for moral experience. You could say moral experience exists. If moral experience exists, then the ultimate cause or explanation of moral experience is God. Therefore, God exists, or therefore the ultimate cause of moral experience is God. And so that would be another argument that you could build using this data. Okay, so I'm not really going into analyzing the arguments here. I'm just showing you kind of the structure for these types of arguments. You start with the moral data, and then you can build a deductive argument where the first premise just mentions some aspect, so some part of that data, so that there are principles, there's agents, there's experience, and then the second premise links that data to the conclusion. And you can vary this conclusion. I use the term God, but that's kind of catch-all. I mean, what do you mean here by God? What are you really talking about? Are you talking about a perfect moral mind? Are you talking about a moral foundation? Like, what do you really mean there? And so for our purposes, we've been thinking of God as a supreme being, or a something than which none greater is conceivable, a perfect reality, perfect being. And my argument has been that from this concept of supreme or perfect, there are other attributes that are deducible, such as perfect existence, perfect knowledge, as well as a morally perfect nature. And so you could think of this as a kind of argument for a perfect being, because you might think without a perfect being, there wouldn't be any moral principles. Okay, you might think that, and you might be able to argue for that. Now, one sort of weakness with this type of argument is that because it has a deductive form, and I think normally we don't really reason deductively, at least psychologically speaking for myself, and it seems like this is true for many people, we look at a wide range of data and we just make judgments about what best explains that data. And these judgments are probabilistic in nature. It's not to say that you can't give a deductive argument. It's just that one of the challenges for the deductive form is to show that no other explanation is even possible. So if there's objective morality, if any of these things hold, then you need to somehow show that the only explanation, I guess you could say the best explanation, is going to be in terms of God, but then the conclusion will be something about the best explanation being in terms of God. And so this is already taking us to a more probabilistic form of the argument, which is the other form I wanted to talk about. So let me just label, this is the deductive form. And then we can come over here and we can give a probability. See, that should be a P. Probabilistic, let's say. Probabilistic form of the argument. Okay, so if I'm going to underline probabilistic, I should underline deductive. That way we're consistent here. So I think you guys can anticipate the way this argument is going to work because it's going to follow the same form of argument we saw when we talked about the fine-tuning argument. So remember there we had some data and then we considered some different hypotheses that would either predict that data or would not predict that data, make that data more probable or less probable. So how does this go? Well, this time let's focus on moral experience. So the first premise could be the probability of moral experience given a perfect being, which would then include a moral nature. You might think that that probability is not very low. In fact, you might think it's very high because this is just the kind of thing that the perfect being itself would want to do, create a world in which there are beings that can experience right and wrong, could have a understanding of a moral landscape. You might even think this being itself could have moral experience. So you might think the probability is not low. Okay, now what happens if we take an alternative hypothesis? So one obvious alternative is just it's not the case that there's any God. And so then you could run the argument that way. But you could also fill it in with something more precise, like you might say, let's just take bottom-up materialism. And on bottom-up materialism, basically you have mindless matter that doesn't have any kind of purposes built into its nature. And then after some time, reality unfolds to produce moral experience. Okay, and we will not even build in anything else into the antecedent here. So you might be sort of tempted to build in some things like, well, we know that there are human beings, so we know that there is the capacity for moral experience. But we don't want to build that into our root hypothesis, because if we do that, that will diminish the prior probability of that hypothesis. Remember, we talked about the prior probability of the hypothesis being the probability of the hypothesis prior to the evidence. So the more information you build into the hypothesis, the more things have to be right for that hypothesis to come out true. And so if we want a hypothesis that's more modest, we'll build in less total information into it. So let's just say mindless materialism or bottom-up materialism. And then we can think about the probability there, and each person will have to consider this for themselves, but you might think that the probability is lower. And you might not think that. Okay, and if you don't, then this argument won't it won't serve you really, because it won't help you get to this result. The result would be that the probability of G all right, hold on a second. Let me scratch that out. The conclusion is that this moral experience supports the hypothesis of G over the hypothesis of bottom-up materialism. It supports it. So it's evidence for it. Again, it doesn't prove it, doesn't even make it more probable than not. It just makes it more probable than it would otherwise have been. And so it adds some evidence on the scale of evidence. So it supports it. That's what that means. I don't want to write this all out. So let me just say it again so it's clear. And this is using the same Bayesian format that we looked at before when we talked about the fine-tuning argument. If you have two probabilities and you have got two hypotheses, if the probability of the data is it's higher on the one hypothesis than on the other, then that data supports the one hypothesis, in this case G, over the competing hypothesis. Okay? I mean, you could just replace bottom-up materialism with not G, but it might be harder to sort of think about that probability in that case. But you could do that. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to just illustrate the general structure of the argument. I hope you can see what I'm trying to do. There's two kinds of arguments, one based on probability, the other based on deduction. Both kinds of arguments are going to have data as their input, and then they're going to use that data to arrive at or attempt to support or attempt to arrive at a significant conclusion. So in this case, when we're talking about moral arguments, you can think of morality as one of the effects that we see in the world, either moral experience, moral agents, or even moral principles, depending on your view of the nature of principles. But you could think of these as effects that we see in the world, and then what we want to do is we want to figure out, okay, what is the best theory that accounts for these effects? And so you can build moral arguments based on this general effort to give the best theory to account for these effects. So I think the next thing that we want to talk about is going to be objections. And I think the best way to try doing this is to send you guys this, and then you write down your questions and your objections, and then I will make another presentation in response to that. Thank you.